The 1980s would prove to be a much better decade for most Americans than the 1970s had been. The economy certainly improved, and the introduction of some new technologies, most notably the personal computer, offered a preview of revolutionary changes in the way people would live their lives in the coming decades. Momentous changes took place around the world, especially behind the Iron Curtain, with communism unraveling throughout Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union itself collapsing in the early 1990s. Still, there were some unsettling trends. In the 80s, the United States government changed from the biggest lender in the world to the biggest debtor, and greed seemed to characterize America in the 80s. Conspicuous consumption seemed to become a national virtue, and Wall Street opportunists engaged in activities that shook the world of finance to its core. Just 2 months into his term as President of the United States, on March 30th, 1981, Ronald Reagan was shot by a mentally disturbed 25-year-old named John Hinckley, Jr. Hinckley was obsessed with actress Jodie Foster, and he apparently thought the fame he would win by assassinating the president would win him Foster's love. The 70-year-old Reagan spent a month recuperating, then emerged on April 28th to address a joint session of Congress. Reagan's calm courage and good humor in the wake of his brush with death had helped his approval rating soar to over 70% and probably helped influence some doubting members of Congress to vote for his budget and tax-cutting plans. As a presidential candidate, he seized upon a tax-cutting scheme called supply-side economics. The fundamental concept behind supply-side economics was that tax reductions would stimulate the economy by producing incentives for investment, thereby generating so much growth, and hence new taxable income, that the government would actually gain revenue. Many economists ridicule these ideas. Even Reagan's own vice president, George H.W. Bush, had once called supply-side voodoo economics. But Congress gave Reagan most of the tax cuts he wanted. The top rate was reduced from 70% to 50%. At the same time, Reagan, denouncing the Soviet Union as the evil empire, pushed for the largest peacetime military buildup in U.S. history, including the Strategic Defense Initiative, a space-based anti-missile defense system popularly referred to as Star Wars. The economy, pumped up by the tax cuts and increased military spending, soared. Unemployment, which in Reagan's first year reached 10.7%, the highest since the Great Depression, shrank to about half that level by the end of his second term. Inflation plummeted from 12.5% to 4.4%. For the entire decade of the 1980s, the gross national product nearly doubled, and an estimated 20 million jobs were created. By these measures, what had come to be known as Reaganomics was a roaring success. But Reagan failed disastrously in his vow to balance the budget. In 8 years, he piled up more federal debt than had accumulated in 2 centuries. Between the fiscal years 1980 and 1989, the national debt tripled from $914 billion to $2.7 trillion. Both political parties played a role in this, but Reagan's administration, which never submitted a balanced budget, was far and away the major source of governmental red ink. In the end, though, there can be no doubt that whatever the long-term impact of Reaganomics might be, the American economy in the 80s was much more robust than in the 70s. And the spiraling inflation that had caused the most economic misery in the 1970s was eventually brought under control. Even historians who are critical of Reaganomics in general credit Reagan's efforts to reverse the inflationary spiral that had so deeply frightened Americans in the 1970s. Reagan's main contribution to whipping inflation was giving strong and undeviating support to Paul Volcker, who had been appointed to be chairman of the Federal Reserve Board by President Jimmy Carter. Volcker's policy of ratcheting up interest rates to wring inflation out of the system helped plunge the economy into a recession, but in the long run brought inflation under control. A major drop in oil prices in 1985, which lasted for the rest of the decade, also helped the economy. As James Patterson says, the return of good times in the mid and late 1980s was enormously reassuring to Americans. The third leg of Reagan's economic stool, besides tax cuts and increased spending on defense, was deregulation. As with supply-side economics, deregulation had both positive and negative results. The most harmful effects of deregulation were felt in the government's attitude toward the environment. But deregulation of the airline and trucking industries increased competition and drove down prices. Most significantly of all, perhaps, was the deregulation of the telecommunications industry, which paved the way for the explosion of cell phones and the internet in the 1990s. Reaganomics was largely responsible for touching off the biggest bull market in Wall Street history. Yet much of the financial frenzy had very little to do with the kind of entrepreneurship that Reagan envisioned. Instead of investing in research, capital development, and higher productivity, many businessmen chose to devote their energy to mergers and takeovers. The attitude of many on Wall Street in the 1980s was expressed in the 1987 movie of the same name, Greed is Good. But two of the most notorious real-life examples of this attitude, Ivan Boesky and Michael Milken, were later given prison sentences and huge fines for their illegal activities. In terms of foreign policy, diplomatic historian George C. Herring says, Ronald Wilson Reagan looms over the last quarter of the American century as Woodrow Wilson I and Franklin Roosevelt II. Unlike Wilson, the former movie actor contributed nothing to the intellectual content of U.S. foreign policy. But like FDR, the hero of his youth, he touched the American psyche as few other politicians have. He restored the American spirit, scarred by Vietnam and Watergate, and afflicted with a loss of confidence and self-esteem. He revived and gave eloquent expression to a messianic vision that resonated with Wilsonianism. Whether by luck or skill or some elusive combination of both, he presided over a rebirth at home and a transformation abroad that set the stage for the end of the Cold War and America's emergence as a global power with a position of primacy unmatched since the days of Victorian England. By 1984, Reaganism was at high tide. Reagan's main advantage when he ran for a second term was the suddenly booming economy that clearly benefited most, if not quite all, Americans. American successes at the 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles, boycotted by the Soviet Union in retaliation for the American boycott of the 1980 Winter Olympics in Moscow, further promoted patriotic, feel-good emotions that benefited the Reagan administration. Reagan also benefited from the worsening disarray of the Democrats. The Democratic nomination in 1984 was a battle among splinter groups. The two leading contenders were Jimmy Carter's vice president, Walter Mondale of Minnesota, and Colorado Senator Gary Hart. Although Senator Hart had wide appeal for many younger Democrats, he could never develop his own compelling program. During a televised debate, Mondale borrowed a line from a popular Wendy's commercial and asked Hart, "Where's the beef?" After that, Hart's campaign wilted. Political advertising on TV also played a role in 1984. The Republicans ran a series of televised ads called Morning Again in America, which highlighted homespun, family-centered values that many Americans associated with the president. Another TV ad called There's a Bear in the Woods depicted a fearsome brown bear wandering through the woods, as the narrator darkly implied that America would be far less secure against annihilation by the Soviet Union without Ronald Reagan in the White House. Mondale got the Democratic nomination and, as Bill Brand says, added fizz to his candidacy by tapping Geraldine Ferraro to be his running mate. Ferraro, a U.S. representative from New York, was the first woman on the ticket of a major party in American history. In the end, Mondale's best hope for winning the election was that voters would decide that Reagan was simply too old. Reagan, by his own admission, did not perform well in the first televised debate and knew that some were attributing his poor performance to his advanced age. But the Gipper, as he was called after one of his most famous movie roles, was better prepared and rested for the second debate. When one of the questioners raised the age issue, Reagan responded, "I will not make age an issue in this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience." Everyone laughed, including Mondale, who later admitted laughing on the outside but crying on the inside because, as he said, "I knew that we had just lost." When the results were in on Election Day, Reagan had crushed Mondale in a landslide, winning almost 60% of the popular vote. Reagan won every state except Mondale's home state of Minnesota and the District of Columbia. Since James Monroe was unopposed back in 1820, only Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1936 had won a higher percentage of the electoral vote. A Reagan biographer expressed it best when he wrote, "Because of his ability to reflect and give voice to the aspirations of his fellow citizens, Reagan succeeded in reviving national confidence at a time when there was a great need for inspiration. This was his great contribution as president." The age of Reagan had reached a new political peak. Early into his second term, however, Reagan's presidency almost imploded because of what became known as the Iran-Contra scandal, an incredibly complex scheme to illegally fund the anti-communist Contras in Nicaragua, masterminded by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North of the U.S. Marine Corps, presumably with the blessings of the CIA director and possibly Reagan himself. As the Iran-Contra scandal unfolded in 1986, Reagan's approval rating plummeted to 36%. Reagan probably escaped impeachment only because it could not be established that he had ordered the illegal actions. In the words of George C. Herring, had Reagan left office in 1987, his presidency would have gone down as a failure, the victim of his own inattention and mismanagement so starkly manifested in Iran-Contra. As it was, though, Reagan still had 2 years left in office, and thanks mainly to his partnership with new Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, those 2 years proved to be two of the most momentous in modern world history. Reagan, probably influenced to some extent by his wife Nancy, started to pursue a more accommodating posture toward the Soviet Union as early as 1984. After his overwhelming re-election that November, he was increasingly concerned about his place in history. Reagan had especially strong feelings on the nuclear issue. It was probably not Reagan's bluster and military buildup that helped transform the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, but rather his sincere desire to rid the world of nuclear weapons and his willingness to risk negotiations. For Gorbachev's part, he was especially anxious to reduce military expenditures, which he knew were bleeding his country dry. He concluded that he had to try to reach an arms reduction agreement with the United States. Nothing else would enable him to save the Soviet economy. And so, what one writer has called an extraordinary coincidence of two extraordinary men led to an unbelievable rapprochement between the two superpowers. Once it began with a meeting in Geneva, Switzerland in November 1985, this rapprochement developed with almost breathtaking speed. As with his economic policies, there is some debate among historians as to whether Reagan deserves most of the credit for these remarkable developments, and in time of ending the Cold War. Gorbachev obviously played a key role, but so did a generation or more of leaders and followers who had long opposed the Soviets and their communist allies. The Western Military Alliance, NATO, played an important role, as did a complex combination of technological and economic forces, including American popular culture. But Reagan certainly played a key role in ending the Cold War. From the beginning of his presidency, he had rejected the notion that the Cold War must be permanent or that communism would long remain a force in world politics. In holding such beliefs, he ignored the opinions of virtually all experts, including CIA officials, most of whom had failed to predict the collapse of the Soviet Union. Reagan's role in helping ease the nuclear threat enabled him to regain some of the popularity he had lost as a result of the Iran-Contra scandal, and to leave office with very high job approval ratings, some 68%. Facilitating the melting down of the Cold War, which almost no one had predicted in 1981, was Reagan's most important international legacy as president.